According to my watch, it's 9 o'clock, and it's time. I think everyone's present. Thank you for joining us today. Cindy, would you call the roll, please?
Curator Covington? Present. Curator Cups?
Yes.
Curator Graham?
Present.
Curator Henriksen?
Here.
Curator Phillips?
Yeah.
Curator Snowden?
Here.
Curator Steelman?
Here.
Curator Stewart?
Here.
Okay, and we have Student Representative Mulderig and Umsel? Yes, here. Okay, you have everybody here?
Thank you. The first item is the consent agenda. Has everyone had the opportunity to review the consent agenda?
See her. She's coming.
Are there any questions concerning the consent agenda? Em, are you going to look that up? Oh, that's an action. Okay. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Even you in the hot.
Cindy, would you call the roll?
Curator Covington?
Yes.
Curator Cups?
Yes.
Curator Graham?
Yes.
Curator Henriksen?
Yes.
Curator Phillips?
Yeah.
Curator Snowden?
Yes.
Curator Steelman?
Yes.
Curator Stewart?
Yes.
Okay, all votes in favor.
Later in the day, we will need an executive session. Is there a motion to go into executive session at a later time?
So moved.
Second.
Cindy, would you call the roll?
Curator Covington?
Yes.
Curator Cups?
Yes.
Curator Graham?
Yes.
Curator Henriksen?
Yes.
Curator Phillips?
Yeah.
Curator Snowden?
Yes.
Curator Steelman?
Yes.
And Curator Stewart?
Yes.
All votes in favor.
The first item on the agenda is an information item, and I believe that's being presented by Brian, is concerning budget, personnel, and benchmark information.
Yes, thank you, Curator Cups. It's actually a joint item between Vice President Rodriguez and I will do the first part, and Vice President Rodriguez will do the second part from her seat there in Rolla. So we'll move through this fairly quickly, and happy to talk about it. Some information that we were asked to present about how do we look compared to peers and that type of thing. Well, the way we compare to peers is through a national really pretty much a standard set of way we classify expenses. And it's really into two programs. It's primary versus support. It's what do you spend on your primary programs of the institution versus all the support things, the overhead, those types of things. And so you can see that the three main primary programs, this has been developed over decades by the National Association of College and University Business Officers, but it's also reported to the U.S. Department of Education. So every school has to report it in these categories, which allows you to do benchmark comparisons. The primary programs obviously are instruction, research, and public service. Those are the three main primary programs that are classified, and then everything else really is in support. And we classify those in academic support, which would be like the libraries and the colleges, that type of thing. Student services, which is admissions, records, that type of thing. Institutional support is really the overhead of the institution. And then physical plant and administration, how much you spend maintaining your physical plant. What I would tell you is this is a key issue for the state of Missouri when it reflects on performance funding. And one of our key measures is the amount we spend on our primary program against the 200 best or top 200 doctoral granting institutions across the United States. And here you can see in this slide that our numbers on a 3-year average were 76.2% of our budget was spent in our primary program areas versus the support areas. And the benchmark of those 200 top doctoral granting institutions across the U.S., the average of that group was 71.7. So this is a key measure that the state of Missouri, the Missouri Department of Higher Education, uses to assess our quality as an institution. And this is Will's measures are across the entire institution, not just campus by campus. So this is a roll-up. And you can see that we've hit this mark every year since performance funding has been enacted by the state. Another piece to understand, and we brought this chart at the last board meeting, and we'll be talking about it also in September. This really is around the green part of the budget, the part that is your fungible money, the money that comes from the state, and tuition is what you do the majority of your academic mission with. It does provide some money for research and a lion's share for public service, but we are not talking about our self-funded businesses, our health system, or gifts, or grants, or contracts. Really what you're talking about when you're talking about the operations budget and how we compare to our peers, it's that bucket in the green, and how do we spend the least constrained money that we have to put to use for the institution. And then this kind of shows over the last 10 years those changes as a system in that essentially that green bucket for the entire system. You can see that our expenditure on instruction has actually grown over 10 years, our percentage of a pie that has grown, and it's grown for multiple reasons. It's grown because there's more tuition coming in the door, both from higher rates and more students. But there's also a greater share of that budget being spent on instruction. The research piece down there is general funded research. That is not externally or extramural funded research. This is research that's done within that green bucket. This is not to be confused with the grants and contracts bucket that we're out to the right. So that has been reduced a little bit. The big number in public service is, quite frankly, our extension. That's the money that comes through for extension. It's about 70-80% of the public service slice of that pie, most notably on the MU campus, but a little bit on the other campuses as well as the land-grant institution. So this gives you an idea of what changes have happened over the budget over the last 10 years.
Back to the previous slide.
Sure.
Institutional support, refresh my memory, or refresh what that's for.
That's everything that doesn't fit in one of the other categories. So that's your chancellor's office, that's all the overhead of the institution, and there's a lot of pressure on that piece in terms of compliance. Compliance that we've been asked to do around Title IX, compliance we've been asked to do. All of those expenses would roll into institutional support because it's not really academic support. It's not really, I guess you could classify it as student affairs, but generally they're so, HR, those types of things fall into institutional support. So that is something we watch carefully. But again, when you look at that compared to our peers, we're spending less than our peers. And we will be showing you more data by campus, by system, in work we're doing for this fall. Oh, thank you. Cindy, I might say which slide I'm on for the curators on the phone. I apologize. So now we're moving from slide 2-6 to 2-7, which shows the FTE enrollment by campus. They're asked to show this. I'm sorry?
This is Brian, it's John Phillips. If you're moving off of 2-6, I do have a couple of questions on that one. That's the double pie chart.
Yes, I just backed up to it. Please, go ahead.
Okay. So if I'm figuring the changes on the public service and on the research, I did a rough percentage, and it looks like over the 10-year period that we have about 38% less being spent on research and about 30% being spent less on public service. Is that a fair summary of those two pieces for 2015 compared to 25?
You need to, at the very top, Curator Phillips, you'll see that the pie back then was $851 million. Today it's 1.158 or 1.15 billion. So we'd have to get you the raw numbers. This was just a percentage of the green operations pie. There's no question that as a percentage of the pie, those have gone down from 10 years ago. But the number I would have to get you the numbers on what the actual numbers are. My suspicion is they're flat or slightly up. They're just not up as much as we spent on instruction. And the reason we're spending more on instruction as a piece of our pie is a couple things, I think. It's the cuts that took place in trying to protect the classroom back in 08-09, but it's also the growth that's on the next chart.
Are we limited in the growth on, for example, public service? Did you say that was largely extension?
72% of the public service expenditures are related to cooperative extension. The rest is like economic development or research park activities, concert, public radio. There's a whole lot of things that fall into public service, but it's not as big of a piece of the pie today as it was 10 years ago largely because of the growth of the campus, all 4 campuses.
John, I'd also comment on, this is Tim Wolf speaking, that in 2005, extension was a system function, and in 2015, it is an MU function. Moving that from system to MU, I'm sure there was many efficiencies that were achieved that suggested that that percentage spend would go down. I would suggest that factored into that major change over time.
Okay, that's interesting and helpful. Thanks.
Did you have any other questions on that slide, Curator Phillips?
Not a question, but it is concerning that our research piece, percentage-wise, decreases.
Well, again, let me reiterate, that is not our external research. That is general funded research in the green bucket. So, yes, we are spending less of our tuition and state support on research support areas than we were 10 years ago as a percentage, but we can get you the raw numbers. It's a different analysis to do extramural funded research that comes in that red bucket that was out to the far right.
That's helpful, too, so it's not shown on the chart.
That's correct. This is just, if I back up to one chart, if you back up one chart, the extramural grants and contracts are out in the far right under sponsored funding. We're talking about research that's actually the source of the money is in that green bucket on the far left when we're talking about the operations budget. So you have to look at all of that together. But given the growth of the 4 campuses over the last 10 years, it's not surprising that a smaller piece would be devoted to research and a larger piece would be devoted to instruction. I think that's intuitive.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Back to the public service. Isn't extension very much a pass-through funded by the USDA?
Yeah, we have to match with some of our general revenue, but yes, it is a pass-through to MU that comes from the federal government to run the extension across the state.
What is the percentage of
that? Chancellor Lofton.
Rhonda. So it started out as a 3-way partnership. So the federal component is one piece, but there's also a significant county component, and then there's what we do at the university level. And so each of that requires that it works in partnership with one another. So the federal part does require matching, but I would say that the part that the university provides at this point is about almost double what the other 2 pieces are. So it's definitely a very complicated set of finances. They also get as much money in grants and contracts and other sources as they do from the general fund. So when you see it on this and it's looking only at the general fund, part of what's changed over that time frame is they found external resources from grants and contracts to help keep up the outreach part of that. And it's showing in here that it's reducing, but as we were reducing the general fund, we were increasing the restricted fund.
Thank you. Other questions on slide 2.6? We're going to move to slide 2.7 for those curators on the phone. This is the FTE enrollment by campus over the last 10 years. You can see as a system we grew by 28% in terms of student. MU was up 33%, Kansas City was up 20%, S&T was up 58%, and UMSL was up 11%. So all of our campuses have had enrollment growth, which would belie why more budget is devoted to instruction and why our pie is actually bigger, because we have more students paying tuition. What has that done to student-faculty ratios? Well, with the challenging state support over the last 10 years, you've seen student-faculty ratios grow at all 4 campuses. The system went from an average of 18 to 10, and this is from 04 to 14. MU's has gone up from 19.8 to 22.1. Kansas City's gone just up from 16.6 to 17.6. S&T's gone from 13.9 to 18.5, in large part to their growth, and UMSL 18.1 to about 18.4. So they've all grown. We've increased student to faculty ratio in part because of economic challenges, but also just the sheer growth of the system.
Let me comment on though you can see efficiencies in this particular chart. You are penalized in national rankings with statistics like that. So like World News Report rankings look at investment per student, and these ratios hurt your position. So efficiency is not highlighted or weighted in these national rankings.
Is there a target ratio?
I think that would be a campus by campus, depending on their competitive landscape and the type of programs they deliver, and I think that's something we can certainly talk about.
I was really interested in nationally.
Oh, I don't know that there is for public universities. I don't know that there's a, quote, best practice or target, but we could certainly look for that.
Could I ask a question? Of course, I've always been taught, and this is always the debate, that you want a lower student-faculty ratio, and that, on the other hand, there are efficiencies that can be gained without instruction falling off. But have we studied, is there a consensus in education as to what is the effect on our students and our quality of education when our student-faculty ratio reaches a certain point? Can we discuss that with any scientific data or anything?
Let me take a poke at that one. Or what you're getting to is if we had definitive measures of quality or results before and after or over time as to what happens. If we had that, you could have some scientific data that would say as student-faculty ratios change, quality or results of that experience in that classroom has changed, either positive or negative. And we don't have that data. In other words, we're not measuring the quality of the academic experience in a way that could say this is a positive or a negative change. It's something that we have to watch and be mindful of, because what we do is our 4 campuses are really focused on serving a demographic that's looking for quality over like just cost. And so what our business model is and attracts the high-achieving students out of high school or transfer students is their expectation is the quality of the experience and the quality of the education lends to the quality of the career or the job placement. So we have to be watchful of that. But to answer your question, net is we don't have data that can say scientifically we're better off or worse off from an academic quality standpoint with these ratio changes.
Do we have any question that if the ratio changes are too high, that there are areas that quality will suffer? And in particular, what's been brought up to me, graduate and research cannot have a continuing student-faculty ratio expansion without eventually suffering. Is that our consensus? Do we think that?
It is mine. I could ask the other chancellors to chime in, but it's my consensus that there is a point of diminishing returns. As you get too high in terms of student-to-faculty ratios, quality is going to suffer. And you have to look program-specific or class-specific to make that determination. Plus, you've got the variables of the quality of the teacher, how much technology is involved in teaching that class that leads to those results. There's a lot of factors that go into it. But unquestionably, there is a point of diminishing return. I'll let the chancellors weigh in as well.
And we're going to bring more data about that this fall that we're working on for you.
Obviously, and I'll be totally transparent, you, in introducing this student-faculty ratio, talked about challenging state support, which I think we will be talking about continually. And so what I'm really trying to ask is if state support goes down, are we pinned in to student-faculty ratio going up? And are we looking at a potential problem with this?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can move around your resources and maintain an existing student-faculty to ratio. I mean, there are levers that you can pull if state funding does decline. You could, and you can do things like cap enrollment. I mean, there's lots of levers that you can pull to maintain a student-to-faculty ratio. So it's not predetermined that if state funding goes down that you automatically have to increase student-to-faculty ratios.
I think that's going to be the basis of a longer discussion this fall. But
I have a comment, Tim, since you invited chancellors to comment. First of all, I can be very discipline-specific. In our nursing program, to get accreditation in the nurse practitioner program, that's 8 students per faculty member. And if we don't If we don't hit that particular ratio, then we don't get accreditation. And if we just go across the range of disciplines, we can have some cases where you have lecture courses of 200, 300, whether it's basic chemistry or psychology, and then some of the applied disciplines, whether it's music, art, or what have you, just by definition, have different ratios. So I think it's a complicated issue. Your points are excellent, Curator, but I feel it goes across the board as to what is the best way of teaching, and also what is the accreditation agency expecting for the ratio.
And let me say this, Chancellor, I appreciate that. The reason I bring that up is that we talk theoretically sometimes about challenging state support, and we put it up as dollar signs and we put it up as percentages. But it appears to me, particularly from things that you've said right there with nursing, that there are real costs to institutions, and not just institutions, but to students, either the quality of education or if you were forced to cap enrollment at the nursing, and that's all I'm trying to understand.
I would like to add something.
Chancellor Schrader, go ahead.
So just adding some comments to what Chancellor George just said. Disciplines make a difference, and particularly those that have laboratories associated with them. That really you are limited to what that class size is. You're limited often by the facilities, by the equipment, and frankly by safety in many, many instances. So you expect with those disciplines that are laboratory based to have a much lower faculty-student ratio for that issue. And so as you can see our numbers jumping up here at S&T, we have a very large percentage of those types of disciplines on our campus. So the 18 means something a little different, I think, depending on disciplines and probably campuses.
First, I concur with what my other colleagues said, but let me add this to your point about graduate students in particular, sir. We have here at Mizzou a declining number of on-campus graduate students, which is really relative to the flat or declining number of tenure-earning faculty we have. We haven't changed our tenured track faculty numbers for quite some time here. They've been relatively flat, and that's led to flatness at the graduate student level because mentoring a graduate student is a one-on-one affair, and there's only so many people you can take care of as a professor. Besides your regular assigned formal instruction, you've got this informal mentoring instruction to do. And I see one grad student nodding her head over there on the screen. It's really one-on-one. And to the extent you begin to try to continue to grow your population of students, you're going to find a diminishing return because of that time is not there to mentor the student. You could spend hours per week on one student. I've done that. I've probably graduated 80, 85 PhD and master's students in my time as my advisees, and I spent incredible amounts of time on each one of them. And you can't manufacture time. So your tenure-earning faculty are the ones that teach these people. You may have non-tenure track faculty at the lower levels, but the graduate level you have only tenure-earning faculty typically teaching. And because of that, you have a fundamental limitation on this one-on-one mentoring instruction here, which does not, speak to the classroom place where you may be able to increase numbers without much impact, but you can increase numbers effectively at this other level because it is a time-constrained issue.
I certainly agree with all my colleagues, and we certainly have a high percentage of professional schools here, and as stated, they all have these standards that you have to meet in order to achieve accreditation. I would also say that all other things being equal, that is regarding quality of students, quality of faculty, and the like, I would expect to see a strong correlation between student retention and graduation rates and student-to-faculty ratios.
I'll just make one more comment. Everything that's been said is right. It's useful to compare MU to UMKC to ST to S&T to UMSL. It would be also much more useful to compare MU to its peer groups, and that means a comprehensive, large, public land-grant research university, S&T compared to engineering schools and so forth. And I think that's one of the reasons why Brian, with some help from others, has put so much time and effort into trying to really focus on who are the right peer groups for us to compare to so that that number is in real context. The second thing I wanted to say is just offer a little hope, and that is Tom mentioned large classes. And I know Cheryl knows this, and I keep saying it, and I'll just keep saying it, and that is, you know, they've kind of broken the iron triangle to some extent at S&T. So they now have high student-to-faculty ratios in things like general chemistry, David, but they also have clear evidence that the outcomes are as good or better and that the students like it more. So if that's true, and if S&T is onto something new, and I think we believe they are, Steve Graham and I do, then we want to try to develop that. And, you know, I've been talking to people in the chemistry department here. Can we transplant that from S&T to MU? Can we take it from MU to UMSL to UMKC?
And what programs does it work at and what doesn't? And also, I think, because I've talked to people in that class, it takes an extraordinarily dedicated professor, I think.
It certainly does. And you have to have excellent TAs. But it does kind of change the paradigm. At S&T, Cheryl could speak to this better than I can. I think they had 6 people teaching general chemistry. They're now down to, what I mean is tenured faculty, down to 2.
Yes, that's absolutely true, and we have fewer graduate assistants as well.
I think John Phillips had a question. John?
Yeah, I did. Just in terms of the changes in enrollment that are shown on page 7, and a general answer would be welcome here. To what extent, if any, have any of the 4 campuses substantially changed their entry requirements?
Well, that's going to be a campus-by-campus answer.
The answer is
right.
They have.
Are we going up or down?
It's about the same. It's about 86% of all students entering as freshmen at MU meet the state requirements. 96.6% at S&T meet the state requirements. It's 70 or so percent at UMSL, and the number at UMKC, I think, is lower. I think it's 65%. So those are people who do not.
I'm not
require
sure
exceptions.
what you mean by entry requirements. I'm talking about based on the entry for each campus in terms of grade, ACT.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, John. The state MDHE has laid out GPA, ACT, and also undergraduate course requirements, and also high school ranking. And we just finished that up last night. We're still in the throes of trying to understand it all. I shared some of this with Mr. Graham. Zora and I did last night. But over the last 5 years, John, they've been pretty rock solid steady. The entrance requirements and the exception rates to those state agreed to requirements have been almost flat and steady over the last 5 years.
And if I could add to that, while we've seen this 58% growth over the past 10 years at S&T, the quality of our classes as measured by ACT and high school GPA has actually continued to climb. So we are not in any way sacrificing the quality for numbers for enrollments.
If I could add also a very specific response, Curator, to the question for us is that for transfer students, which actually is the majority of our first-time students, we this year raised the entering requirement from a 2.0 to a 2.3. Now, if they have a associate's degree, they can transfer, and that's actually made it a little more challenging for us in terms of getting numbers of students in, but that we've actually now raised the entrance requirement for transfer students.
At UMKC, I think, as mentioned, our admission rate is about 65% of the students who apply, but to violate that would be you do so at your own peril, because you would you'd impact your student retention and graduation rates. So it's a complex issue, and we need to stay the course.
Great, thank you.
If there's no other questions on that slide, we'll move to slide 2-9 for the curators on the phone. It's the pie chart that at the top says compensation is 78% of operations fund expenditures. We've shown this to the curators before, but this is a very labor-intensive business of teaching students, doing research, maintaining large physical plants, and so we spend 78% of that green bucket paying people to come to work and paying for their benefits, their health benefits, that type of thing. And this is the transition slide to Vice President Rodriguez. And since we have the screen here, Betsy, if you want to tell me, I'll advance for you if that sounds good.
I was hoping you'd say that. Okay, thank you. The first slide that you see is somewhat complex, so let me walk you through it if you haven't had a chance to look at it. I'd like to have you focus on the dotted lines that move across the screen. And at the bottom, the blue dotted line there is administrative staff, which are our higher level staff. In the middle of the screen, you see the gold dotted line. Those are faculty numbers. And the dotted line at the top are staff. And so what you're seeing is a 10-year history of the number of administrators, faculty, and staff. And you can see that those dotted lines are very flat. So we have had very little increase in the numbers of employees over the 10-year period. The straight or the solid lines that you see in this corresponding colors are the dollars that we've spent on salary and benefits. And those lines have, of course, gone up. Again, not because the number of people have gone up, but because there's been incremental or small increases in the salaries over that same 10-year period. If there's no questions, I'll move on to the next slide. This gives you a picture of staff we have. The previous slide was showing you really just full-time staff. On this slide, you see both full-time and part-time staff. While it looks like we have roughly 40,000 faculty and staff on the payroll, on any given payroll, we pay significantly less than that because many of those 20,000 part-time folks are seasonal or infrequent and are not paid on every payroll. I'm going to focus mostly on the 19,000 on the blue side of the chart, but I want to briefly give you a look at who we have in the part-time categories. So on the next slide, which is 2-12, you see a breakout of our part-time faculty. This is a pretty mixed group of folks. The largest by far are our student employees. Many students, as part of their financial package, have jobs on campus. Some have multiple jobs, usually of small numbers of hours. We have graduate students, and then we have part-time staff and faculty that are in all kinds of different jobs. And as I mentioned, very seasonal for the most part. We move to the next slide, which is 2-13. Yes?
What are academic other?
Those would be part-time faculty. So they can be, I'm sorry, they're not. They're usually academic support staff. So they might be working as student tutors, maybe a part-time advisor. That kind of thing. Okay. So they're directly supporting the academic mission, but not doing teaching or research. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask Betsy to clarify, what's student academic?
Graduate teaching assistants. We have lots of those. On the next slide, which is 2-13, I'm going to focus now on those 19,000 full-time employees, but this slide does exclude those that are in our healthcare system. So you can see that we have a fairly even breakout between teaching and research, our regular staff, either hourly or salaried staff, and then, the hospital is on there, but it's broken out separately. As we've implemented our new global grading system for staff, which is our way of categorizing staff, we now have the ability that you can see on this slide, 2-14, to really break out what kinds of staff we're paying. And we have about 9,500 staff if you include part-time, and about 8,000 if you exclude the part-time. And this is a somewhat busy slide, but I'll just tell you that our largest job families or categories of staff are in office and administrative, finance and business, IT, and then our research and student support areas. If there's no questions, I'll move on to talking about how we pay staff. And as you all know, we have gone through a a streamlining of our staff structure, and I'm going to not really cover this slide because we talked about this at a previous meeting. So if there's no questions, I'll move to the compensation philosophy slide, which is the next slide. This is a compensation philosophy that we use for both faculty and staff. We developed it about 5 years ago. We're trying to attract and retain highly qualified faculty and staff by having salary and benefits that are competitive. We use that when comparing against peer groups, which we'll talk about in a minute. We try to be cost effective, and we compare against national benchmarks for that, especially on benefits. And we try to make sure they're valuable. That's part of the retention piece of this. And as I've mentioned before, there are many things besides just salary and benefits that are valuable to staff and faculty, so we try to make sure that we provide those programs as well. So let's talk for a minute on the next slide about how we do measure ourselves against the market. It works a little differently for staff than it does for faculty. We have a very different system for staff. As I mentioned, we've recently redone this, and we have a very good way now of measuring ourselves against the market. What we do every 2 years is we take jobs and compare them to like jobs out in the marketplace. And that can be a local market, it can be a regional market, or a national market. It depends on the job. So typically, the lower level the job, the more narrow the market will be. So on a custodian job, we're going to be looking at a local market. On a mid-level manager, we'll be looking at a regional market. And of course, at our highest level, our executive positions, we'll be looking at national markets. Let's take a look then at how we actually compare to the market overall. And today I'm staying very high level. I'm not looking at this by campus. I'm just looking at it overall for the 8,000 employees that are on this system. The vertical line there in the middle is what we consider the midpoint of the market. So we call that market. Now, what's unique about the University of Missouri is that midpoint for us is actually the 40th percentile of the market. It's not what most people would use, which is the 50th percentile. When we went to the new structure, it was really unaffordable to do that. We were far enough off market that we chose to target ourselves to the 40th percentile. And I want to make that point because even using that 40th percentile as the midpoint, you can see that a significant number of our staff are below market. And the good news is we now have very clear measures of this. The bad news is we have a lot of work to do. Any questions about that? If we move to the next slide, I'll talk about faculty, give you some ideas of how we do faculty data. First of all, this is a very campus-specific and even more importantly, discipline-specific market comparison. So the first thing we do is work closely with the campus academic leaders to make sure that we understand the best way to find market data for faculty. Currently, we're using overall 5 market comparisons. We break it down in different ways. But in general, we're using the AAU, both the public and the private. We typically focus mostly on the public AAU institutions. We also do a data cut excluding the coasts because we tend to see very high salaries if you're looking at University of California or New York universities, for example. We're also able to look at some of the larger public institutions, so we have a group of about 50 of those. We also look at what's called the Urban 21. These are good benchmarks for the St. Louis and Kansas City campuses because they focus on universities that are research universities that are located in urban areas. And then we pull the APLU data, which are the land-grant institutions. There's overlap among these different groups, and we're able to pull those out as needed. But the most important part of this is that it's really by discipline. So it's very difficult to look at faculty and say, overall, the faculty, for example, at S&T are above or below market because it's really going to vary by discipline. And Chancellor Schrader and I had a long discussion about this yesterday. So we actually have a tool, and I'll show you at the very end of my presentation, whereby departments can go in and pull data by discipline and look at it that way. And that's what matters because an English professor is going to have a very different market than a chemistry professor, for example. So if you look at the next slide, I just pulled out the MU data because, frankly, it's the easiest to do with a very clear comparison to the public AAU, and this is done each year. These are the public AAU institutions, and I've shown this to you before. It always lags about a year and a half, but MU is at the bottom of the AAU peers. Again, I'm going to stress that this is not a discipline by discipline review. This is simply an overall comparison to AAU, and that makes it very difficult because I'm quite sure there are some faculty in certain disciplines at MU that would be much higher on this chart. But overall, when you look at the mix between among disciplines, you see MU at the bottom of AAU. I was asked how are annual salaries set, and I just wanted to quickly explain to you that this is done campus by campus. This is not something that's done at system, and this changed about 4 years ago because campus budgets are so different. So the campuses determine what their guidelines are going to be, whether they're going to have a campus pool or whether they're going to require departments to fund those. It's more common these days that departments are required to fund the increases. They are effective September 1. They are supposed to be based solely on merit. My little asterisk there is that we still have a significant number of salaries that are below market, so that is taken into account until we get closer to market. Typically, they're base buildings, so they're usually a % increase on the person's base. We do have some promotional increases that are given, especially for faculty who, through their academic progression, may go from assistant to associate professor in the same year that they're getting an annual increase. And then we do require all departments to complete performance evaluations, whether they're academic or staff positions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Do we know, again, we're talking numbers, what is the impact on either the institution or the students of having low faculty salaries in comparison to our peers?
Well, I might actually let the chancellors answer that. I can tell you that it probably differs quite a bit by campus and by discipline, but Chancellor Schrader, do you want to take a stab at that?
So one of the issues, particularly as we become more visible, is that we have we continually are trying to fight against other institutions sort of picking off the best faculty, and they often are offered some much higher salaries at other institutions. So that's one thing. We do have, I believe, more turnover because of the salary issue. And then, of course, that just costs more in terms of startup. And so it's something that we need to get a handle on it. Also, you know, there is, I believe, a perception that the salary relates to the quality of the faculty. And so I think we do lose opportunities for recruiting some of the top faculty, but also I think some of the top students who are really looking at a measure of quality in terms of the salaries for the professors.
I was just talking to Tracy about this, curator, and it could be that it's maybe from the student's perception more acute at the graduate level as opposed to the undergraduate level because they identify more with the faculty member, and often they go to the institution because of the faculty member, and so they might find more of a correlation of salary and quality. But Tracy can answer that better than I can.
Yes, and if your faculty member is persuaded to go elsewhere, after tenure, you have the difficult choice of do you follow them or, do you revise your project and start over. So it's very acute at the graduate level, but undergraduates, I don't think notice as much.
I'll comment if you like. The statements made before by Cheryl and Tom and Tracy are certainly accurate. Hiring a faculty member, retaining him is not just salary, though, sir. That's a piece of it, but it's also who their colleagues are. And so it's a multiplying effect here. If one person leaves you because they're faculty, you may lose 3 more because they tend to move where their colleagues are and they want to work together in a certain kind of collaborative environment. So it's not just a single faculty member at a time. There's actually a multiplying effect when you both attract a faculty member and also try to retain them. It's not just the salary for the individual, the cluster of people you're dealing with here, as well as facilities and other financial aspects that are built around it. In engineering especially, the life sciences, physical sciences, it's not just the salary. I've spent $20 million on startup for a single faculty member in my previous life. So, you have, it's a rare thing, but you have these kinds of other factors here. But I would emphasize that colleagues are one of the most important single issues in both retaining and attracting faculty members. They like to be with people who they feel are going to help them be better.
I can't add hardly anything else to that except to say that at the undergraduate level in our Conservatory of Music and Dance, for example, they select that theater department and the like because of the faculty who are here. And top faculty tend to attract top students and help them on the ranking side as well. So it can be important in some of the undergraduate disciplines as well.
Okay, well, related to that, on the next slide, which is 222, you'll see a history of our pay increases, and I think this really tells you, as I've said before, how we got in the boat that we're in. Often, and again, Chancellor Schrader and I were talking about this yesterday, often we do find bringing in assistant professors at a fairly competitive salary, especially if we can get the startup package where it needs to be for their research program. But we start losing ground immediately because we have a history of low salary increases. And you can see in 2011 we started breaking it out by campus, and many of our pools at that point were at the 0 level. So we're getting people in, but we're having a problem keeping them. And you can see that in the low number of full professors that we have across the campuses.
Can I add something to
Please.
that? We're somewhat unique in the state of Missouri in that the professors at our public institutions are not considered state employees. So at other public institutions in other states, when state employees receive an increase, it applies to all of the people at the universities. So what that means is we're a little unique among the University of Missouri system campuses in that we have to self-fund any merit increases. And that took some adjustment in my thinking because I was used to saying, okay, there was 1% coming down from the state, new monies for merit, and then you could add on to it internally. But it was not solely the responsibility of the institution. And what that means for us at Missouri S&T is for every 1% merit, we need to find $1 million in recurring. We need to carve it out of our own budget. And that is really, we need to do more. We were talking about this yesterday, but it's very difficult for us to carve out $1 million for every 1% increase. And, I guess I just wanted to point that out because when you look at our peers, some of them, and I would suggest many of them, don't have to fund that solely on their own.
Thank you. So when you have pools, and sometimes these aren't pools, they're being shared across the campuses or being funded by the departments. When you have those small amounts of money, it's very hard to figure out how to spread that money, and often it's spread fairly evenly just because it's a small amount of money. So what you see on this next slide, which is 223, is our new way of trying to do it for the staff that are at system, and this is being adopted by the S&T campus and somewhat by MU and the other campuses, I think, over time. What we're trying to show on this slide is that we're tying salary increases to performance very directly. We're also taking into account where someone is on the salary range, which is what that comp ratio term is at the bottom of that chart. So the green part of this chart says that if someone is a high performer and not yet at market, that's where we're going to funnel the money. So we might have a very small amount to spend. It might be 2% or less, but we might be giving raises that are 4 and 5% to this very small group of people. And that's really the only thing you can do when you have a small pool. You have to be comfortable with the fact that you have some very good performers, successful people who are not going to get much increase. And that's somewhat difficult for people to understand, because on this chart you see some red areas where those are pretty good performers and not yet quite at market, but we're not funneling money to those people. It's been pretty effective for us, but it does show what you have to do when you have a fairly small pool. On the next slide, I wanted to just briefly cover who makes pay decisions.
Can I interrupt before you go on too far?
President.
Absolutely, Curator Phillips.
Okay, so yes, John Phillips. So I'm looking back on 22 and thinking about how you're handling the merit-based performance. But when I look at page 22 and I look at the increases, because it actually goes back 12 years, our increases have not over time met either with inflation or with the average increases in public or public and private sector.
Correct.
I do enough negotiations to look at this and say, well, we're lagging behind general population in terms of increases, although there may be a year or two when it was close to 2%, but going back early in the decade, they were averaging 3% or more. And so what Cheryl said struck me, that apparently many states actually count their public higher education with across-the-board increases, whereas what we're doing apparently doesn't get automatic increases or across-the-board plus merit. I think it would be, and I know that that's part of the reason why we drop in the rankings when we see the AAU rankings. I wonder if it would be a useful exercise for us to or maybe there's actually something that has done this, that identifies the states where they're included in the state across-the-board increases, identify how prevalent that is, and I'm also curious about whether the same is true for the other public colleges and universities, including the community colleges, as to whether they're included in Missouri across-the-board increases for state employees. Maybe you already know the answer to that, but I think the point is a potentially very important point if we are an outlier in not having that built in and instead having to do everything merit-based out of the budget, which continues to grow smaller. That the fact that we have a process that may differ from the majority of our peers and the majority of states may be something that we ought to look at and consider trying to get some kind of reform. I may be overreacting to the point that was made, but I actually didn't give any thought to that, but I think as I look at the 12-year history, I can see why we are dropping in rankings on faculty support.
Sure, we can look at that. Brian, I'm looking at you because we can look at that for the retreat data.
Curator Phillips, I think that a lot of states, including Missouri, have moved their annual increases to performance funding. I think it's over 35 to 40 states now do some form of performance funding, and I think that the state legislature would say that is what, if we're going to give you increases to do salary, we want to see specific performance. The challenge is when we only get a performance funding number of 1.5% on our base, doesn't give you a lot of room to work with. You all approved us asking for something closer to 5% next year, 5%, given where the state revenues are, and something like that, if we continue to hit our 6 performance targets, would give us a base increase that we could actually move towards salary adjustments across the system. But you know how that's going to be. That'll be a challenge because there's lots of competition at the Capitol for new funds. But I think that's where I think that most states are moving this towards is performance funding equals what used to be across the board COLAs, and there's pretty good data on that nationally, but we can certainly bring it to the retreat.
Chairman.
And actually, I think not just in education, but most of private industry as well.
Oh, sorry. Let me. I was probably not real clear. Todd Richard. Richard Ford. Yeah.
I think that's true across private industry as well, but it often is a base of some general plus performance. I guess I'd be interested if most academic institutions have gone to total performance-based funding. If they have, then what I've just said and what Cheryl has observed may not be very meaningful, but so that's an interesting question, whether it's all performance-based or whether there is some, I think we've gotten away from COLAs per se, but nevertheless, a general base increase recognizing CPI and then performance on top of that. But
Curator Phillips, this is Curator Henriksen. I don't think the state employees have gotten as much pay increase over the last 10 years as the university has. So we would, before we want to get into that boat, we want to see what it looks like.
Well, I would.
It may be true since 2009, but prior to that, I would hope that they were getting more than 2% increases.
I'm pretty sure not, but we'd have to look at the data.
I think Curator Covington wanted to.
Just that I think that if we decide to commit time and resources further to exploring this idea, if we decide to do that, that the negatives that might adhere to adopting this system should be studied as well. In addition to what Curator Henriksen has said, which I also believe to be fairly accurate with respect to the state of Missouri at least, there may be other detriments associated with going to this concept. So if we decide to commit lots of time and resources to exploring it, I would ask that we do it in full, not just part.
So exploring what exactly?
Curator Phillips is suggesting that we might want to look into taking up a position in which we consider making the University of Missouri, or the system employees, state employees.
Yeah,
that's my request.
I don't think that really makes any sense, because we're still going to get the same amount of money, and you've got to figure out how to divide it up. So just because you put a label on the fact that we're state employees, that really doesn't mean anything as far as I'm concerned.
And I don't believe recent history of state of Missouri employees increases has been very good.
It has not.
So that's not something that would, based on recent history, be advantageous for the University of Missouri system employees.
Yeah, it looks like we've got to do a really good job. We've got to be efficient, and we've got to figure out a way to get more revenue to help pay for some of these increases.
My point in bringing that up was merely to show that we perhaps are operating from a deficit standpoint as compared to some of our peers. And I do want to just clarify, as a point of clarification, the funding coming from the state is not COLA. It still would be distributed based on merit. So you'd have to be careful about restricting your language to that. And then the other point is that in Idaho, for example, we did not just use the funding that came from the state. We then did add to it at not only at the university level, but also at the unit level, at the college level. So we used it. We use that to sort of supplement and get much higher salary increases.
Okay, we are on pay decisions. So overall, pay decisions are typically delegated. The chancellors have this delegation from the president, and typically it's delegated further depending on the position. In general, faculty and staff pay decisions are handled at the unit or supervisory level with approval going up to the next level. And then I am not going to cover the last two slides. I'll just show them briefly. These are the tools that we use. This is just a snapshot of our online resource for departments and accessing data for faculty. And if you go to the next slide, Brian, you'll see a similar tool that we provide in helping calculate what might be a total compensation package for somebody. So we do offer a number of tools to department chairs or staff supervisors or managers who are trying to make pay decisions. Be happy to take any last questions.
That's the extent of this presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Questions? Marcy, John, any questions?
No.
David? Well, if there are no other questions, we'll move to the next item on the agenda. And that being presented by Tom Richards?
I'm going to start first. Okay. And Tom and I will tag team this one. This is the next section entitled Capital Planning and Debt Management. We've got it up on the screen. We just wanted to walk the board through, take advantage of today's meeting to just talk about where we are. And you'll see we've got a great deal of information here for you. But before we start on debt, we just wanted to remind the board and maybe for some new members how this process works. And as you know, and this isn't true for all higher ed institutions across the U.S., we're very focused on campus strategic plans and a system strategic plan that all rolls up together. And candidly, that's why it's up in the top left corner that everything begins with a campus strategic plan that's been approved by the board, reviewed by the president before it's even come to the Board of Curators. So when we look at capital planning, we want to look at something that ties to the strategic plan of the campus. It makes sense. That strategic plan, once approved, informs the campus master plan, which also is brought to the board periodically for update because our campuses are evolving. They're changing. They're obviously growing based on that slide in the prior presentation. So they have additional capital needs to serve additional students. And what that master plan then does is inform their capital plan. And we brought those annual plans to you last month across all 4 campuses. It was in great detail. We didn't go into them in the presentation, but each campus has a capital plan, and each campus has a top priority project for state funding, for other types of funding that is brought to the board for their review after it's come through the system. And then that capital project each project has to have a proposal of how it's going to be funded. And what do those funding sources look like? It's a very different thing to build an academic building where you might have to take money out of tuition or state support, which is somewhat new to the system when the state didn't keep building academic buildings, versus building a residence hall where you've got a revenue stream of students paying the residence hall over the life of that building. So we look at those proposals. They're brought to both our capital planning department and system, the treasurer's office that's headed by Tom, and my office, and we look at what that looks like and we talk with the president about that plan. That's when it's brought to the board for approval, and then we work on what is the best way to finance it, and the campuses figure out what's the constructability, what's the timeline, how are they going to get that done, what's the delivery method, is it design build, is it design bid build. There are multiple ways to get it done, but this is an iterative process, but it really does start with the campus's strategic plan. And that's the test that the system does, is how does this tie to all your plans and your objectives going forward? How does this project tie? And those are the litmus tests we apply to it, in addition to what's the fundamental financials behind this project. Moving to the second slide about debt capacity, it is one of many factors we think you should be considering when evaluating capital project requests. We think about it every day when we see this. You also need to know that debt capacity is a limited resource. It is not an economic free good. It is a limited resource that we have to manage and look at and make trade-offs. And from a strategic perspective, in the third bullet, I would also say there's a cost to not investing in our facilities in terms of our marketability of our institutions, in terms of the safety of our institutions, in terms of being able to continue to maintain strong enrollment patterns. There's a cost to not investing as well. So those are the weighing you have to do, that we do it at the system with all the campuses before we bring it to the curators. And we would just say, and Tom's going to walk you through the next part of this presentation, at this point, as of today, we have the capacity to meet the strategic borrowing needs of this system while maintaining a strong credit rating. We have good fundamentals. That is not true across the country among our peers. There's ratings being changed all the time, but we look very strong right now, and Tom's going to walk you through kind of where we are. We have some new curators just about that in the next set of slides.
Slide 5. So I'll provide again an overview of how we manage debt and ultimately issue debt and deal with all the parties that are involved in that whole process. This is just an overview, just some background of the team that we work with. So in addition to our internal staff, we work with a financial advisor, Prager & Company, that advises us on the issuance of debt. Prager is probably the leader in the higher education space and works with a significant number of well-regarded issuers in the marketplace. Our current team of investment banks that we're working with is Barclays, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America Merrill Lynch. All three are, again, leaders. Their higher education practices are leaders nationally in terms of working with other peer institutions on debt issuance and financing issues.
Were there any questions from curators on the phone? Okay.
Not yet.
Thank you, Tom.
No, we're good.
Okay, so on slide 6, Brian talked about the overall approval process to the point where a project is brought to the board for approval, and I just wanted to take it from there and also point out that there's really two different kinds of approval that are going on with respect to the board. First of all, when a project, as Brian mentioned, will come to the board, and to the extent that any project has a component of debt funding as part of the funding source, when the board approves that project, the board is inherently authorizing that project to incur debt to finance the project going forward. So when the project comes to the board and it meets the test, the strategic test ties back to the plan, the board approves that project, inherently we've authorized the project to borrow the money from the treasurer's office. And so that's sort of one really key distinction to point out how we manage the debt, which is a little bit more sophisticated than many of our peers. We call it a central bank concept. That's not really important, but the main thing to know is that the campuses and their projects actually borrow internally from the treasurer's office, and we manage that debt then from a central perspective. It's not like Project A comes to the board for approval, it's approved, and then we go out into the markets and we borrow money for Project A. That's a very inefficient way to provide financing, and there are other benefits to the ways in which we do it. So the projects will come in, the board will approve projects. We'll actually look at a list of slides of projects that have been approved or we haven't yet issued debt. The Treasurer's Office has multiple sources of financing, which we'll talk about, but ultimately we figure out what's in the best interest of the institution over the longer term in terms of the issuance of debt. If we get to the point where we feel that more external funding is needed to fund the portfolio, then we will come to the board and ask for authorization to issue debt to external constituents. So it's really two different approvals. One is specific to the project, and the second approval at some point would be specific to the actual incurrence of debt. And also I would point out from a collected rules perspective, any external debt of the university of any amount has to be approved by the Board of Curators. On slide 7, so this is one of my favorites, and I wanted to throw it out. I see this on both sides of the balance sheet when we're looking at the investment portfolios and the debt portfolios. We all know, right, that rates are going up. We're certain of that. We've been talking about it for 5 or 6 years, right? This is put out by, I think it's Deutsche Bank Research, which is just an interesting graph. What this is really showing you, the dark blue line that you see, is the path of actual interest rates at the 10-year point on the curve. The dotted lines that go up from all those peaks, those were consensus interest rate forecasts from that point in time. So you can see over the course of a decade what the consensus of professional forecasters had expected versus what actually happened. You can see a pattern. Your best course of success over the past decade was to take the consensus rate forecast and bet the opposite way. This is actually not unusual. Everyone in the market, and this is again both sides, this is the debt and the people that buy the debt, everyone wants to be optimistic. And in an optimistic sense, rates rising is a sign that the economy is stronger and picking up, and everyone wants that to happen. Reality is sometimes often different. So there's always this thought that we should issue debt because rates are low. Rates are low, but I would also point out for the last 3 times we've issued debt over the past 3 or 4 years, each time we've issued debt, we've had lower rates than the time before. And each time we said rates are incredibly low, this is a great time to issue. My point is, and this gets back to the way we manage the debt portfolio, we don't do this at a point in time or on a project-by-project basis. We've got to look at the longer term and in terms of what's in the best interest of the institution. And going forward with debt issuance based on an idea of where interest rates would be generally a bad idea. And there are, again, better ways to manage the rates. The one other thing that I'd point out, everyone does have some belief that rates will rise, but of course no one knows when, and no one really knows by how much. You might suggest, given what's going on in the world, that 100 basis points increase, a 1% increase in the longer rate would be pretty dramatic and maybe quite possible. The thing I would point out, though, for perspective, even if rates jumped up 100 basis points, we're still at historically low interest rates. So the point being, this should not drive a decision of when to go forward with a project or not. But it goes back to Brian's point, the strategic plan should drive that. And once that process has gone through, we go out and execute and borrow in the best way possible for the institution. The next slide, which is slide 3-8, is just a snapshot of our debt portfolio overall. You will notice a ramp up in debt from roughly 2007 through 2011, and then somewhat of a flattening out. That coincided in large part with the programs that were put in place during and after the financial crisis. There was a program called the Build America Bonds program that was authorized by Congress that had some tax incentives for public debt issuance, and we had made decisions to invest at that time. Since that time, generally the portfolio has been somewhat level.
Excuse me, Tom. There's somebody on the phone line. We can hear the phone ringing. If you wouldn't mind muting your phone.
Yeah, it's not mine. Sorry, phone. Not mine.
Okay.
Narrowing it down.
It's somebody else. Maybe the folks at Mornet can help us mute whoever that is. Sorry, Tom.
Okay.
Go ahead.
How about Curator Stewart? Stewart, you?
Okay.
Stewart, you want? No, that's not mine.
Can you hear me now?
We're having problems with accountability.
Oh my God.
It's a very nice tune.
Very nice.
There we go.
Okay, so the back one more point on the slide. I wanted to point out, just in a general sense, that we have 2 different ways that we can issue debt. One is through the traditional system facilities revenue bonds. So think of long-term, 30-year debt, traditional debt, and the other facility that we have is a commercial paper program. So we're one of the few higher ed institutions that really has the sophistication and the financial strength to have their own commercial paper program. When we instituted this back in, I believe it was 2011 or 2012, the board authorized a program of $375 million overall. It's basically, you can think of it in terms of a line of credit. With the commitments that we have under that program currently, and then allowing some reserve capacity for just liquidity purposes, we have about $200 million in capacity in terms of commercial paper. the way this works, just again to let you know the flexibility that we have, we could literally call one of our partners, and in this case it would be either Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, or Barclays today, and say even Monday we want to issue $100 million in CP. And on Monday, or probably literally by Tuesday, we'd have $100 million. So that's kind of the sophistication of our program, our partners, but it also speaks to the financial strength of the institution, that we have that kind of access to the markets. So this is another thing I'd point out, though, in terms of the flexibility that we have to finance projects that the board would approve. We don't necessarily need to go out and issue long-term debt if it doesn't fit. If we wanted to finance projects at some point, we can use the commercial paper line. Gives us much more flexibility in how we finance. Slide 3-9. So we looked at the portfolio overall, and I just wanted to point out we also look at where the debt is among the campuses and among the different units on the campuses. We provide this information to the board on a quarterly basis in that debt snapshot report that comes out with investment information, but I thought I'd just highlight a few areas of concentration that we talk about quite a bit. As a line item in total, housing, of course, is the highest concentration of debt within our portfolio at 31, almost 32%. Of that, the MU campus has nearly 19%. That's just something to be aware of. There's probably a limit in terms of how much exposure we want to housing, but at the same time, from a credit perspective, it's a very good risk in terms of issuing debt because you have a solid, steady source of cash flows. The top 5 areas of concentration: housing at the University of Missouri Columbia, at UMKC, the campus utilities at MU, as well as athletics, and then the health system at about 21% of the portfolio. One of the questions then as well is in terms of the distribution of debt, if you want to think about an equitable basis. What I would point out, at least with respect to the MU campus, they have about 46% of the debt. That's roughly equivalent to their similar percentage of net assets of the system if you want to look at it from different perspectives on that.
I'm one of the new curators who hear about the financing. How many of those lines is the debt secured by revenue that is directly related to that line? For instance, athletics. Is that debt secured by athletic revenue?
Yes.
And is that true of all of those lines, or there's lines where that's not true?
It would be true. Well, I mean, ultimately,
Mainly the campus.
Everything has a dedicated revenue stream.
But I knew that, but I'm just saying, how many of the dedicated revenue streams are directly from that particular source?
Almost all of them.
All of them? Okay.
But are they secured by the campus revenues as a whole versus I think David asked, is there a revenue stream that secures it? And as lawyers securing...
From a legal perspective, the system facilities revenue bond program is ultimately secured by what you might think of as all of the auxiliary revenues of the entire university system.
So that's true of athletic too. It is not strictly.
It's a university-wide program. It includes the healthcare system, so the healthcare system revenues are a part of that. There's over $1 billion of revenues on an annual basis that are theoretically pledged for debt service with the program. That was put in place in 1993. It was actually a very progressive thing to do at the time, and it's one of the things that allowed us to get fairly sophisticated in how we manage the debt because we do it collectively together instead of on a one-off basis. That also benefits the campuses that, standing on their own, might have a lower credit rating and would have higher borrowing costs. Similarly, we brought in the healthcare system, I think it was in 2006, as well, and that benefited the healthcare system by giving them a lower cost of funds.
So all the bonds are secured by the total system-wide revenue, including athletic. Is that?
Yeah, ultimately, the curators of the university are the ones that are issuing debt.
Personally guaranteed.
But by way of example, we wouldn't let athletics pursue something of this nature unless we were convinced athletics had a source of revenues. And in fact, some of those units within there, we have pretty high expectations of what backup sources they might have if one of their sources. So athletics, for example, we expect them to hold some revenues in case they would have a dip in 1 year because the campus isn't going to go in and pay the debt for athletics.
And that is true of every line.
The vast majority, but some of those lines you see are things we would consider
Classroom research.
Classroom research
for example,
is-
our critical repairs maintenance is really part of our general revenue commitment. But everybody else there has their own revenue source tied to pay back the debt for those particular.
And the reason we always talk about buildings with debt. Do any institutions of higher ed issue debt to, for instance, injection of faculty salaries or adding faculty or anything like that? Do any institutions do that?
Some have and have failed miserably because they did so.
We've seen pension
Really a
bonds
bad
issued by some
bad
states and universities that have been disastrous, and
Yeah.
school districts, candidly, across the country, that have
You're
issued
not
long-term
recommending
debt to
that,
try
are
and
you,
solve a
David?
pension.
No, I'm just saying that theoretically, if something happens where our state funding may be affected, debt does not provide a way out. Right?
An analogy would be the Ivy League schools. The Ivy League schools actually went through a really tough time around 2000 and dipped into their endowment principles to pay off faculty and so forth. When it's been done by state universities, Brian and I could dig it out for you, it's been a disaster. Yeah.
And the other thing, back to the colors of money in that earlier chart, most of these are yellow. Most of these are those self-funded auxiliaries. A couple of them are green in the sense the classroom, and that's new because the state used to build all of our academic buildings, and that's not been the case for quite some time. So back to those different types of money that we manage, most of our debt is secured by those self-funded businesses, healthcare, intercollegiate athletics on the MU campus, residence life on all 4 campuses. That's in that yellow bucket. That's in that piece, not necessarily the green bucket making those debt service payments for the lion's share of it. Fair, Rhonda?
Yeah, we take steps too to make sure that we're limiting risk to the campus in general when we have auxiliaries borrowing. So we, and they complain about it a bit, but we do ask them to hold some balances to ensure that if they have a hiccup that we aren't instantly on the hook.
So, David, in addition to, and this just came up when we brought Dobbs Phase 2A to the camp board. We had a big discussion with Rhonda and staff within Residence Life at MU about what their projected fund balances look like, given that the debt load is bigger. And those are discussions the system, the Treasurer's Office, myself, and Rhonda, we have. So we aren't just about issuing debt, and they have no question to weather a downturn in enrollment or a downturn in folks in the housing village.
Taking it all up to sort of the key theme, and one of the key themes that I would like to leave with the board in terms of managing the debt, it's not about borrowing the money. It's about paying it back.
Yeah.
I just, in seriousness, I mean,
We probably should say that one more time. It's not about, it's not about borrowing the money. We probably should have had its own slide. It's about paying it back.
Could we take out student loans? Or?
But, again, I could have by Tuesday $200 million for you. I could have another $300 million within 6 weeks. Access to the market and the acquiring of debt is not the issue. It's the critical assessment that the project is supporting our strategic plan and that there's a dedicated, solid, robust, reliable revenue stream to pay back the bonds. That's the key.
And the other piece, if it's incremental to the campus, they need heating it, cleaning it, maintaining it, building a reserve so it doesn't fall down. So it's not just the debt service, it's also all the other costs that come with opening a building. Let's move to this next one.
So this is just a snapshot of the actual structure of the external debt that's outstanding to external borrowers today. There's a few things to highlight. One of the key points, though, aside from the structure itself, is all of the projects that borrow funds from the Treasurer's Office are amortizing, most on a 30-year amortization schedule. So they're generating cash flows of principal and interest back into the central bank. So over the next 5 years, roughly speaking, we'll have about $190 million in principal payments come back in. That's a key element in factoring in debt capacity going forward because you're kind of reusing that same capacity as projects pay down. Now, one of the unique things about what we do in structuring the portfolio, you'll see the darker blue bars, which are fairly evenly spaced out through roughly 2040, and then you'll see these big bars out there all by themselves. We've issued several bullet structures The most recent of which was the one farthest on the right-hand side of the page that matures, I think, in 2055, I think, 2054, somewhere out there. That was a 40-year taxable bullet that we issued. Now, we actually did that last fall to take advantage of the interest rate environment. So when we do issue, we certainly want to take advantage of what the market's giving us. So that principal on that $150 million bullet is not due back to bondholders until 39 years from now. Now, we have to pay interest payments to the bondholders during that time. That doesn't mean, though, that the projects that are financed by that aren't paying still on a 30-year amortization schedule. What it means from a very, very long-term view is that we've locked in very historically low rates with great flexibility for 40 years, and we can reuse that money over and over. So as the first project that's using that starts to pay the principal payments back in, we can take that money and we can lend it out again. It's a way to grow our borrowing capacity internally without having to take on external debt for the entire amount. Currently today, and we're early into the amortization schedules, but currently today I've got about $14 million from this recycling method that we can apply to the next batch of projects when they need the funding. The next slide, 3-11, this is just a reminder.
Hey, Tom, just on the last slide.
Yeah.
So that's a great explanation, and I really think it's pretty brilliant, too. The one question I have is, we have had historically, for the last few years, historically low interest rates. What happens to this approach if interest rates start to really rise rapidly? I know you said what you said before about interest rates, but we can't predict them one way or the other.
Well, actually, if interest rates were to rise rapidly, we're in a very good spot because we've locked in an extraordinary amount of long-term funding that we don't have to pay back until 30 or 40 years.
Exactly. So the point is that we'd be paying back over the next 30 or 40 years, one way or the other, with dollars that are a heck of a lot cheaper than the net present value of those dollars today.
Hopefully. Hopefully. You know, but again, we all...
it can't get worse than it is now.
Well,
or better.
People have said that, though. We really don't know, though. So we want a balanced approach. But the key
when you're
is...
at 2%, you know...
Hey, Tom?
It can't get lower.
Yeah.
John Phillips. So I see on the line where it says the patient-centered care center, 30.5, June 14. Is that what the groundbreaking was?
Yes. Yes, Curator Phillips, that was because it takes about a year to design a building. So that was approved last June. They spent the last year designing it, and now they've broken ground to begin the work on it.
I had in the back of my mind that was a $40 million project, and so the debt financing is 30 of the 40, or did I have the...
These would be the amount of debt. This is the amount of debt in the project.
Some of the projects, Curator Phillips, come with cash in addition to debt putting together so that they don't have as big a debt service. I think that was the case with this project. And candidly, we haven't, what Tom's about to tell you is we haven't not issued this debt yet because they haven't needed the money yet. They've used their fund balance or whatever project dedication for that. And Tom can talk about why we haven't issued $154 million worth of debt you've already authorized as a board.
Yeah, in the most extreme example, the very first project, the Dobbs Group Phase 1, which the board approved that phase in June of 2013, there's still $54 million in debt we haven't issued yet. Well, we haven't issued it for a reason because they don't need it. So, you know, again, that the flexibility of the structure that we have allows us to deliver the financing sort of on a just-in-time basis so that these projects, these entities on the campus aren't paying interest on money that they basically cannot use. That probably worked okay in a previous economic environment where we might have gotten 3 or 4% on cash, but when cash is giving us about 5 basis points, it's very costly, even at low rates for debt today, it's very costly to have that sit and just have to pay interest. And because of the flexibility that we have, there's really no need to do that. The main point, though, is that the board has already committed, approved an additional $154 million in debt that we have not yet issued. So it is not outstanding.
So just going back to page 9, where it talks about the allocation of existing debt, it shows there that healthcare has a 21% share under MU Healthcare. So when we get projects that come through MU Health or maybe the med school, but I trust this is just MU Health, are we aware at the time that we approve projects to the extent to which it will be legislatively supported or will be debt financed?
We bring that in all the decision items to you about how we're going to finance the projects before you're asked to approve them. All of it.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And the patient care center, I think, is an MU project, medical school project, not a healthcare project. So that would show up, Curator Phillips, over on the MU side in academics or classroom research, probably in that bucket in this case, because that patient-centered tower is not MU Healthcare, I believe, right, Rhonda?
It's not clinical space.
It's not clinical space.
Teaching space for the Springfield expansion, where we're going to get more doctors in the state of Missouri and be able to partner with the hospitals in the Springfield area.
Okay, great.
Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. So I think slide 3-12, this is just a snapshot of the institutional investors that hold our debt. Really, all of the top issuers nationally that acquire municipal debt, particularly higher ed, they have us in their portfolios. We're extraordinarily well regarded in this world. We're viewed as a sophisticated issuer with great governance practices, and we're a significant player in the market. That gives us access, that gives us liquidity and respect among the people that are buying our paper. So rating agency perspective, one of the things I'd also mention, just from all the institutions on the previous slide, none of them make decisions to buy debt based on rating agency conclusions. I mean, quite honestly, after the financial crisis, anyone that still was using the ratings from the rating agencies pretty much abandoned that. I can guarantee you that each one of those institutional buyers in terms of debt, they are doing their own independent analysis. They're looking at the balance sheets, the income statement, the audited financials. If they're interested, they're asking questions about our strategic plan. They're looking at our competitive position. They're looking at where the debt is currently. They're looking at the sources of repayment for the debt. They're doing a credit evaluation of the institution. The credit rating from the agencies means very little to the purchasers of the debt, except for it's a slight indication of the liquidity that debt has in the marketplace. So I can tell you, because I've heard that so many times, and we also have the benefit of hearing it on the other side too. So we have a significant amount of our endowment and retirement plan invested with PIMCO, as an example, which is one of the world's largest fixed income managers. PIMCO will tell you they do not look at the rating agencies because they feel that they are much more sophisticated than the rating agencies. They have higher power tools and analytics. They do their thing. The rating agency designation is really kind of a nice to know. So that's just kind of background of what actually happens in the market. Having said that, these are just some comments taken out of our last rating agency reports from both Moody's and S&P. Again, we're highly regarded. We're going to talk about the rating in the context of that. I would point out, one, I don't have a calculation in terms of getting to a certain rating or a certain debt capacity amount. We are looking at that. We do bring that to the board, but we are just at the end of the fiscal year, and we'd like to have fresh data so that we have the latest ratios. The other thing that's going on is that both Moody's and S&P are currently in process of revising the way they rate higher education institutions. S&P is further along. Well, they're further along in what they're doing. Moody's has just issued some guidance, and it's open for public comment. Neither rating agency intends the changes to have an impact on probably more than 5% of the institutions that are rated. I just point that out to say that it's an evolving thing. So in terms of trying to answer a question, it's even more difficult right now in terms of what they're thinking. I will point out, though, one of the interesting changes in Moody's, and they've shifted around weights and focus. Moody's is placing greater focus now on the strategic direction of the institution. They want to know the competitive position, they want to know the plans to compete, they want to know the strategic plan, and they want to know that the strategic plan is taken seriously and actually managed. You're managing to it, not just designing one and putting it on the shelf. They're placing less emphasis on the traditional metrics that you might think of in terms of enrollment, things of that nature. They want to know that the institution has a plan to compete and ultimately to survive. I think that fits us well.
Let me ask this question. So what you're saying is that 10 years ago, let's say, these two rating agencies were much more valuable to us than they are today?
Well, it's the whole change in culture since the financial crisis.
Yeah.
Municipal debt in general, because of the way it was structured and insured at one point in time, most buyers did not do credit analysis of municipal debt.
Right.
They trusted the ratings, they trusted the insurance companies that were insuring the bonds.
Yeah.
And when we went through the financial crisis, that all collapsed.
Okay.
And so any institutional buyer of debt certainly now is doing their own independent credit analysis.
So what I said was true. Okay. So, but we still want to be rated high by both.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And from our standpoint, it's good in at least looking at other institutions and how they compare them, et cetera. So it's still valuable to us, but not as valuable.
It's one of many indicators.
Okay.
It's certainly important. It's not the most important thing, especially in the context of where we are.
And just as another data point to reinforce the importance of strategy, management, governance, when we went out for some new financing, I was interviewed by both Standard & Poor's and Moody's Investor Services, and there was minimal time talking about financial statements and balance sheets. It was about the strategy, the process, the prioritization, the governance. And so they do spend time with me and other leaders just to make sure that they're comfortable with the future and the ability to have predictable revenue streams to pay off the debt.
And that fits in to the governance of the institution, because I can guarantee you that when the analysts go out to a lot of the other higher ed peers, they're not meeting with the president. But because we knew what our strength is in terms of the strategic planning and managing by it and knowing the importance of that to the rating agencies, we for sure made sure that they met with the president directly. So again, it's how they view us in terms of how we manage the institution. The next slide. So this really provides context. This is a distribution of rated public institutions. So other public universities nationally that are rated, in this case by Moody's. This shows you the distribution of ratings across from the very best. There are 8 institutions that have a AAA rating. There are 13 with a AA1, which is where we sit. And then the bulk of them are in the AA2 to the A1 position. This is just Brian, I just want to make one this is the breakout. That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
When we're looking at this and thinking about it, again, and I've been saying this for 3 or 4 years, the credit rating is important, but in the context of everything else, it's relatively unimportant. It's even more so when you look at the context of where we are. Most of our peers are to our right. The distinction generally, and yeah, Brian, that next slide will show you specifically, there really is no distinction between the current rating that we're at in terms of AA1 and AA2, moving down one notch. And again, if you talk to the people that help issue the debt, if you talk to the people that help buy the debt, they really could care less. I've actually been told by some investors that if we drop down to a AA2, we would have more demand for our debt, because there would be the slightest increase in cost, which would be enough to trigger some investors wanting to buy us. We've been told that our credit is too good, and that makes our debt inexpensive. So I'm just saying there are a lot of dynamics in the market, but the bottom line is a AA2 is an outstanding rating. A AA1 is an outstanding rating. Now, if we were, just to be honest, if we were at a AA3, Brian, could you go back just one slide?
Yeah.
So my advice would be quite different. If we were sitting at a AA3, maybe on the border of potentially dropping to an A1, I think that would be a much bigger deal with much more significance, because there would be more of a market impact. But looking at either a AA1 or a AA2, I would suggest to you that we should approach that a point of indifference. That we go back to the strategy being what drives any decision. This is really not a factor that, in my opinion, should weigh into any decision to move forward with the strategic plan, provided that it's supporting the strategic needs of the institution, and there is a rock-solid plan in place to repay the debt.
What we've highlighted on this sheet, on this slide, is the SEC institutions, and you can see that there's only one that's to the left, and then all the rest are to the right or even below, compared to our system. So peers get cut a lot of different ways, but the majority, as Tom said, are actually AA2, and surrounding state institutions as well, for the most part, with a few exceptions you can see. So what's it mean in terms of borrowing cost?
Yeah, so this would be a representative cost given our current rating and our spreads in the market. If we were rated either a AAA, a AA1, or a AA2, I mean, you can barely see space between those three curves. We've broken out the information in the table. So to give some perspective on a generic $100 million tax-exempt borrowing with 30-year amortization, so plain vanilla, on a AAA basis, it would cost us $5.716 million a year in debt service. On a AA2, $5.766 million. It's not relevant. But I would make another point and suggest that even going from a AA1 to a AA2, if the additional debt service were $250,000 a year more, $500,000 a year more, that still shouldn't be a deciding factor. It should go back to the strategic plan. And the question is the project strategic to the institution? So if a project truly is strategic to the institution, I don't think that as long as the funding source was there, I don't think that you would decide to execute your strategy or your strategy based on some incremental cost of debt service. That would probably not be a sound business decision. Now, by all means, you have to have the money for the debt service, but if you can cover that, I don't even think that would be a deciding factor if it was truly a strategic project. At this point in time, though, it's not an issue because there's almost no difference in borrowing cost.
Any questions? So I think just to summarize for Tom and I, again, which is exactly what Tom said, using our debt capacity should be driven by the strategic needs of the institution, not necessarily are we in this bucket or that bucket. And we believe we're well positioned to do those things. And again, we'll just say again, it's about repaying the debt. It's not necessarily about issuing the debt. And so that's our challenge to when campuses bring projects to us. They show us that, and they know that. They know that they need to show us a healthy repayment and reserve strategy before we would bring any project to the board for consideration and potential debt issuance for the institution.
Well, in one of the previous presentations, I don't know how long it's been, there was a discussion of how much more debt that the system could issue and maintain the AA1 rating. And my recollection was another $250 million, somewhere in that range. Is that accurate? Is my recollection off?
That we're going to continue to look at that, but to be quite honest, that's throwing a dart at the wall. There are so many factors and there are so many variables that go into that to try to predict that with any level of certainty. It's almost to the point of we worry about being misleading. What I can absolutely guarantee with 99.9% certainty is that we have enough debt capacity through the AA2 level to provide anything we could possibly need over the next decade. I can pretty much guarantee that, and I hope I'm here that decade to live that out. We look at that, but it depends on what the project is. It depends on the source of revenues. They might look at an athletics project different than a dormitory or a health system. There just are so many variables that go into that.
Hey, Don, it might be easier if we just told you that what you've asked is the classic inverse problem, and mathematically it's a very complex, nonlinear, chaotic process. And so it could go in the forward direction, but not the back direction. Does that make it simpler?
Let's show it off. Well, even having said that, so in real dollars, though, I mean, can you give us a range? You mentioned the next 10 years. Are we talking 300 million? Are we talking about $1 billion? What's the total dollars out there that you?
I think even assuming we would change to a AA2 at some point, we would, I think, comfortably have at least $500 million in capacity. But again, the other factor to consider is that all the debt is amortizing.
Yeah.
So I mentioned we've already got $14 million in cash flows from our recycling program. So that will allow us to actually generate funding for internal financing as well, which means that we don't have to go out and borrow. The other thing with commercial paper, not that we'd want to permanently finance something that way, but the rating agencies rate that in terms of capacity as if it's fully drawn at $375 million. So what that tells me is that I could issue $200 million for sure tomorrow, and I can guarantee that has zero impact on our credit rating. But I don't want to finance a 30-year project in commercial paper.
Because it resets weekly. Or monthly.
Yeah, however long we would issue.
Right.
But it gives us lots of flexibility to finance projects, especially during the construction phase. Realistically, and others can speak to it more than I can, but if a project were approved today, assuming that it's at the point of approval, it's probably still a good 24 months before it's going to need meaningful cash.
Right.
The way construction ramps up, and so we have good flexibility to help minimize the cost of the project by being able to deliver that just in time.
And just to remember, there's $150 million of additional debt already authorized that we haven't issued yet, that we'll be asking you at some point to issue. So you need to think about that 150. But again, as Tom said, over the next 5 years, we'll retire 190. So it's kind of we really haven't moved the needle. If over the next 5 years, that's all we do. So I think there's room. $500 million I'm comfortable with as well.
Okay.
So I don't think, again, the issue isn't do we have the capacity and the ability to raise capital. We absolutely do. It's about how we pay it back and how our comfort level with those revenue streams.
Other questions?
Let me ask one other question, or make one other comment. On the early slide about when it's finally brought to the Board of Curators, I mean, you go through about 5 steps there. Actually, though, in reality, we know about all of these projects as they go along and as the planning goes on, the strategic plan, etc. So it's not like you're waiting till step 6 before the curators ever know about this project. I mean, I think that slide kind of gives the impression that, well, the curators really don't get involved until they bring it to the board. It was like your first or second. Yeah.
Well, what we're trying to say is there's a process by which we push them all through.
Yeah.
And you may know about it, but that doesn't mean they are ready. It's not ready for prime time.
I understand that. But we also don't want to give the impression that the board never knows anything about this until the time you bring it for board approval.
Well, in your materials in June, there was a long-term capital list.
Yeah, I understand that.
That was billions of dollars.
For the general public, though, in the press, I mean, they need to know that we're not just looking at this in the 5th stage of this.
But you're right. You're absolutely right, Phil, and that's why we updated all the campus master plans, because that's a very futuristic view. Here's where we are now. Here's what we're thinking. So we give insight in terms of what are the buildings that will be considered in the future. You're absolutely right. Is we want to get you current in terms of future thoughts. Yeah. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. We don't want to be bringing.
And that's all I was trying to say.
Sure.
Well, but in line with what Phil is saying, and I don't know how you do it, because obviously the board is a continuing organic group, but you and I are kind of new to this. I've looked at the master plans, and I've looked at the strategic plan, and those aren't my master plans. I mean, I didn't vote on those, and frankly, I have some disagreements, and I don't know how we work through that. I mean, we can't just undo it all the time.
You want us to look at your master plan?
I haven't gone that far. But it is something that was set a few years ago, and the world changes, and the members of the board change. So, to an extent, we're kept involved. But to the extent that you and I didn't share in the master plan, which is where it all stems from, we weren't involved.
Of course, we're given the opportunity to comment at any point and say what we think, and try to alter whatever it is that's going forward. And I know you will, David.
they are more refreshed here than in other environments I've worked in, David. I do think that if there are specific issues, I think we can work with you to talk to the campuses about pause you may have, Phil, you may have on a project or that type of thing. It is a continuous process, and we understand the world changes and things like that. So I don't know that anything's locked in, and really it's not locked in until you vote on it, is what we're trying to say here.
But David, if there are significant differences in the strategic plans at the campus, it makes everything between you and either the campus or the system, it makes everything downstream more complex. So we've got to resolve what you see as concerns relative to the strategic
Well,
plan.
and to do it as a board as a whole, I mean, I've made very clear. I looked through the campus master plan at Mizzou, and I don't like what I saw in ACT scores. It was vague and nebulous and compared to other measurements, and that's just me. I'm just one board member, but that's my perspective.
Okay, but that wasn't an item in the strategic plan.
No, but it's in the campus master plan. It was in the strategic vision. It was in it's in a campus wide that I went to on the website to try to find strategic vision.
It's in the strategic plan, what our goals are over the next few years.
Yeah.
Whereas this is really about the capital.
I was talking facilities. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So
see, that's what. Yeah, but that's one example.
Because David, the strategic plan has an operating part and a capital part.
Okay.
And then we were detailing the capital part because it deals with long-term financing and debt financing. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So,
but it does, and I did miss out on that, but to an extent. But it's still, as we go through these, I don't know what the process is by which we. I mean, I can go to you, Brian, instead of Tim, and say I don't like this, but believe me, I'm finding out that I'm not even sure the board of curators say anything matters sometimes, but the one curator sure doesn't. Isn't the way to do it.
Other questions? Not. This is probably a good time to take a short break. Why don't we take 10 minutes and everyone will be back promptly in 10 minutes because I will start promptly.
Well, I like this. You're taking charge now, aren't you, Don?
I don't think so. I think they're going to go through.
You need to say that again, Curator Cups, because you were on mute.
Oh, say it one more time.
Am I on mute? Am I back on?
You're on.
You're live.
You're green now.
Okay,
They
thank you.
probably pay money for that.
The next item on the agenda is the proposed change to the collected rules, and if you'll go to your materials in page general business, page 2-4, it's a markup of the 330.050 political activities. This proposed change has been proposed by President Wolf after review of all of the regulations. This regulation was originally adopted in 1974, and it applies when university employees are running for office and what the office is concerning, whether it's an office, a part-time office that doesn't interfere with the activities of or their employment at the university, or a full-time office. You know, we want to encourage our employees to be active in their communities, to be on the school board, to do serve on city councils, etc. But then also, if university employees decide to run for a full-time office, then this rule affects when they're required to leave the employment of the university. And there's been a number of examples since 1974, 1992, and 94. A university professor ran for Congress and took a leave of absence. Senator Graham, who was from Columbia, left the university employment. The former UMKC law professor is now the setting Secretary of State for the state of Kansas. We acknowledging that the previous rule was that when you file for office, you had to either take a leave of absence or resign from your employment at the university. And what we attempt to do with this rule is try to make it more applicable to the current financial demands of a campaign, where previously you might file in the primary election and then start raising money. Now everyone's raising money the year before or 2 years before. The campaigns have already started for the governor's office and other statewide offices. The Senate campaign for the United States Senate is in full swing almost 2 years before the election. So that's one of the reasons that we think it's important to amend the rule to show that, or to make it applicable to today's campaign finances. Specifically, the new rule would require employees seeking a full-time public office to resign or be granted a leave of absence as of the earliest of the following dates: when they register an exploratory committee, when they register a candidate committee, or when they file for office in the file in the primary. That would say when you start raising money for your campaign, then you need to make arrangements to leave the university's full-time employment. So most of the other major universities have similar rules, and we've had research done as to what other major universities have done, and that what we are attempting to do is to modernize our rule to make it applicable to the way it is today. So, President Wolf.
Thank you, Curator Cups. In addition to the primary change, there are technical changes that include changing references from staff to employees to ensure the scope of the rule is clear for all employees, and also adopting gender-neutral language. We continue to believe that employees should be permitted to engage in political and civic activities that do not take away from their university positions. This amendment modernized our policy to reflect the reality that active campaigning for full-time office starts earlier in the election cycle than it did 40 years ago. While I'm open to the board's thoughts on the effective date, I am recommending this take effect immediately. I'm not currently aware of any employees that would be affected by this immediate effective date. And when we have a change to a collected rule and regulation such as this one, it's important to implement immediately to give our employees adequate time to contemplate their interests in running for political office. Back to you, Curator Cups.
I think the draft language, and the president is recommending that become effective immediately. The draft, if you'll turn to your materials, page 2-3, it actually is the proposed motion. And the effective date is left blank because there was different discussions about when it should become effective. This time, I will open it to discussion by the board members. The one thing that I would ask, if someone makes a motion to adopt the motion shown on page 2.3 or 2-3, that they, in their motion, state what they believe the effective date is in that motion. So, discussion?
I have a couple questions.
Yes, sir.
No surprise. As I read the rule changes, it also affects the duration, not just the beginning point, but the duration of the leave of absence. Steve, is that right?
I don't know whether it affects it or not. It tries to clarify it.
Well, it clarifies that a particular leave of absence is effective till either the date of, must be taken till the date of exploration or to the date that the candidacy ends.
Or the date that they take office.
Okay. Now, there is, as I understand it, the rules are different for a 1-year leave of absence than for longer under the current rules. Is that right?
I'm sorry, ask that again.
Is the rule different as to who has to sign off between a request for a 1-year leave of absence or a leave of absence that is a longer period of time?
Longer than 1 year?
Yeah.
Right now, I don't think we allow them for more than 1 year.
Okay. What if we make this the effective date and there has been approved a 1-year leave of absence, are we saying that this vote automatically extends that 1-year leave of absence for a longer period of time? Or are we saying there has to be a new application or request for leave of absence? How are existing leaves of absence that are less than the term of this rule affected?
I don't know if the rule addresses that.
Should we address that?
It's up to the board.
If we don't address it, who gets to interpret that?
David, let me see if I'm understanding, because I got lost there. If there is currently an approved leave of absence,
hypothetically for 1 year,
okay, and we adopt this rule change,
which states that a leave of absence to run for office must go to the latter of the dates of either the end of the exploration or the end of the candidacy.
What section is that?
The last section.
Well, I'll just speak for myself. I do not intend this change to extend the rule that leaves of absences are for up to 1 year.
Well, but this could.
Well,
obviously be more than 1 year.
I'm setting and reading it here.
Good, Mr. Chairman. Chapter 340 on absences talks about leave, in particular the leave of absence under personal leave. Does limit to 1 year, but there's a final sentence saying any extension of the 1 year limit must be approved by the chancellor. So there is a vehicle.
Right. And what does this do? What does this do to that?
I can't answer that. That's more of a legal.
I don't think it does anything.
Well, again, we're only talking hypothetically, but let's say that there has been a leave of absence granted until September 1 to run for office. If the primary is won, the candidacy lasts through November.
Something has to happen on September 1.
Under this, you believe? What has to happen?
A decision has to be made. I don't think this addresses that at all. It tells you when you have to apply for leave.
Well, it says the leave has to run to a certain time.
No, it doesn't.
I'll bet you it does.
The purpose, the old rule did not have an end point. So theoretically, it was possible to receive leave.
Right in the middle of an election cycle.
To receive leave and then come back to work the next day. Okay. So what this tries to make clear is that once the triggering event happens, and you have to take, if you have to resign or take leave, you must remain in that capacity until basically you're no longer a candidate.
Okay. How does this affect present leaves that may have been granted that is in conflict with this rule?
I would say if a leave has been given for a year and it has a specific endpoint at this point, then something has to happen on September 1 because that person is still in a candidacy.
And what has to happen?
Well, they either have to get the leave extended or ask for a new leave or, I suppose, resign. But they're still within the triggering event.
But this says the leave granted to run for office has to be no later than the date the candidacy ends, which could theoretically be in November.
Must remain on leave of absence.
Yeah. If we vote this, here's what I want to make very clear. If we vote on this, are we grandfathering in a particular leave and right now extending that leave that is hypothetical to Election Day? Because if we're doing that, I'm not going to vote for this.
I think you've made a good point, and if someone wants to offer an amendment that would include that would address that situation, I think that would be a good idea.
With adding the language that nothing in this rule shall be construed to extend the duration of leaves of absence, would that resolve the issue?
Well, it depends on how you view the issue. I mean, I would like to say that this rule is effective immediately, and any leave that don't comply with it must be reapplied for. Now, I am probably the only one here that wants to do that.
The effect, I haven't thought that through, so I'll let you tell me what you have in your mind, please. The effect of needing to reapply would solve the problem for you? And what would be the downside of that?
I don't think there'd be any downside.
Is anybody else able to speak to the question that I just lodged? Because I haven't thought it through, as I said.
Well, there could be a significant downside to an employee who is already on leave and has to reapply.
After that year has expired.
So, if there were an amendment.
I think that what David is saying is that if we adopt the rule, then individuals that are on a leave of absence would have to reapply. That's what you would want. Is that correct?
That is. Now, let me say this, too, which is interesting about this and the whole way the rule has been interpreted, is that it seems to be a specific rule on political activity that I think a reasonable interpretation is that the leave of absence has to pertain to that rule and to political activity and should be governed by that rule. We don't have, it's such a general rule, it doesn't even have in that rule who really makes the decision. You know, it is interesting that for part-time positions, the president of the university makes the decision whether it's part-time, but that a leave of absence can be granted by a designee of the provost. And those seem kind of incongruous to me, that we take at least a higher level of authority to make a decision on whether something is part-time or full-time than we take to make decisions on running for political office. And I would also argue that the decision to grant leave to run for political office have potential implications in a wide range of areas that we've heard about, particularly financial, even potential borrowing. I think you can study in the University of Wisconsin what happens when there's an open war with the legislature. And these are things we should consider.
David, do you have some specific language that you'd recommend to amend and make this palatable?
I always hate to do it when I don't know if I'm going to get a second. You know, I've been down this rodeo before.
Well, you could always say, I'm thinking about it, here's the language that I would propose for.
I am thinking about saying that this amendment to this rule is effective immediately, and any leaves of absence that are not in concert's not the word, they're not in accordance or do not conform, thank you, to this rule, must be reapplied for and must be brought in conformance with the rule.
What about people who rely on the current rule to conduct their affairs, and any retroactive effect upon them that might be negative, or even if you're going to be really dramatic about it, some sort of imposition of lack of due process?
Well, I don't know if our legal counsel decide whether we really have a property interest in a leave of absence. I looked at that very quickly, and I think that is highly contested as to whether. Here's the issue. Let's face it, tenure is a property interest. That's been established, right, Steve? There's no question about it, right? Leave of absence has not been established as a property interest. In my very brief reading of the law, Steve, I know you've probably come across this before, so you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong, but that's how I read it.
I'll be happy to give you a legal opinion in executive session if we need to move into that.
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way. If I give a legal opinion that is totally full of baloney, nudge Ann and let her tell me I'm full of baloney.
I'm tired of doing that.
So let me ask you, if they had to reapply, would they still be bound by the one-year rule?
Well, that would be my second part of what I would suggest. I think that applications for leave of absence to run for political office, which are different in my mind and have far graver consequences for the institution, or more implications for the institution than any other leave, should be at least the chancellor level. And if we're going to be consistent in the rule, if the president is making a decision as to whether or not a part-time office takes away from, and therefore can be held, that it should be at the president's level. But I would leave that up to the chancellors and presidents and administration to make that final decision.
But I'm trying to understand where you're going with your amendment. So if you made it effective immediately and felt that required them to reapply, the existing leave rule has the 1 year presumptive, I would call, duration. So are they going to be bound by the 1 year duration, or are they going to be? Is the purpose for them to reapply to see if they fall within the
I would argue
potentially
that
longer?
My intent would be that they reapply.
Right, but what's the end? But what's the end date?
What do you mean? What is the end?
Well, as I understand, what you're asking for is that because there is potentially more than a 1 year duration under this rule, that they need to reapply, so it's clear. So then, if they reapply, are you saying that they are then eligible for a leave of longer than 1 year?
They are reapplying under the new rule, and it is for what this rule says. If it is to run for political activity, this rule says the leave is not for 1 year, that it is at least until the candidacy ends.
I don't read it that way, David, but I can understand how it could be read that way. It would appear to me that the initial concern would be fixed by nothing in this rule shall be construed to extend any leave of absence or the for the leave of absence policy. The other issue is completely different, but I don't know if there's other thoughts. It's not like we don't have a lawyer in the room. Or on the phone.
Well, what's the goal?
Well, as a practical matter, let me just say, as a practical matter, your suggestion or your possible change would only affect people that right now that have on any of the 4 campuses already received.
That's correct.
A leave of absence.
That's correct.
For any reason.
For any reason.
No. I think leaves of absence for political activity should be very specific and should be under this rule.
But I think he's raised a point that we hadn't really thought about. We were so worried about when we started the leave that we didn't take into account that that timeline would be longer than a year. I just don't think we really thought that through.
And the implication in goal 2 is who makes these decisions. I frankly think that decisions to run for political activity should not be signed off by vice provosts. I think they should go to at least the provost, not a designee, but I think it is such a significant issue that should go to the president or the chancellor, which would be consistent with the first half of this rule, which is we say the president makes the decision on part-time versus full-time.
So you're suggesting the president would be making the decision on part-time or full-time?
Yes.
And then whether or not this employee can run for a political office?
No. I wish we would quit conflating the idea that we have some power over whether a person can run for political office. Our only power is whether we grant them leaves of absence and all the concomitant benefits to run for political office. I would never tell someone whether they could or could not run for office.
Okay, so the decision is on leave of absence.
Yes.
Gotcha.
The leave of absence, if I'm understanding correctly, the leave of absence that policy is 340.070, is that correct?
So let me, while you all are looking for the appropriate policy, just talk out loud about the design, the current design. Is the leave of absence decision is an option that is in collective rule and regulation, whether to grant that or not. The decision is made by the superior that that person is requesting it for. The superior makes an evaluation of how important is this individual to us long term. If it's somebody that's easily replaceable or whatever, we say denied. If you want to do this, resign. If it's somebody that we want to keep on board or come back, then they look favorably towards the leave of absence, and that's a department chair that goes to a dean that goes up to the vice provost level or whatever for signature. So that decision gets made down there. So if it's now my decision of leave of absence, then I would have to overweight or overrule the department chair or that superior that has evaluated the long-term need for this particular individual or interest in this person coming back.
You would have to weigh the impact on the institution versus that individual coming back, yes.
Curators, would it help with the ambiguity that you're concerned about by simply striking that sentence?
Well, I don't know. It would help the ambiguity, but to the real world. See, we are all dancing around in this little kabuki dance, and we all know it. Well, there are real implications to these decisions. that could be tremendously expensive to this college and this campus and this institution. We just had a presentation on bonding, debt, our faculty salaries, and I think that if we're making those sort of decisions, that it should be made by people not who are solely interested in whether that individual comes back or not, but who are interested in the institution as a whole and whether or not we can stay in the AAU, whether we can be excellent, whether we have the money that we need to do the things that we as curators think need to be done. Or, frankly, whether we're going to close our eyes, bury our heads in the sand, and simply say, we can't do anything.
I was addressing the.
Well, but I wanted to make what I believe.
You're in a whole other area than
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Well, I am. That's right.
I'm just, my first thing I heard you say was express concern about the end point.
Well, I did because the reason I got in this area, are we grandfathering in a present decision? And I think we might be.
So my question would be, does removing that sentence help that particular
That
issue?
solves the grandfathering in.
I realize you've got other.
So, Steve, what you're saying is if we delete such employee shall not be eligible for rehired by the university or must remain on a leave of absence until the latest of the following,
Correct.
down to the first day of office?
I believe that if you struck that sentence, that would cure the ambiguity that Curator Steelman expressed. However, I think he's got some other
Well,
problems.
no, but I mean, that's better than, because we all know, I mean, to grandfather in a outstanding leave could make bad matters worse.
Well, let's resolve one issue at a time. Is there, I guess no one has moved adoption of the proposed rule. What I would suggest is that if someone is considering making a motion to adopt the proposed rule, that they do so. When they do so, they delete the sentence, such employee is not eligible to be rehired by the university or must remain on leave of absence until the latest of the following dates. The date of the person concludes his or her exploratory activities, the date the person concludes his or her candidacy, or the date of his or her first day in office. If I'm understanding what's being said, that takes out the ambiguity that this rule could extend a leave of absence.
I think that's true.
If we take out that sentence, does that mean that someone who is successful then would remain on leave even after they've been sworn in?
No, John, I believe the next sentence takes care of that.
You're in 070. I don't have that in
No, I'm in, this is the proposed rule that is on page 2.5 of the Board of Materials. It's under subparagraph B.
Right. You say the next
2B. Excuse me.
Don, can I inquire?
Sure.
In addition to that, do you have any thoughts on who should be granting leave in this particular area? Whether it should be specific to this rule?
Let's resolve one issue at a time.
Now that was a political answer.
I will say that is that I think that we need to specifically adopt a leave of absence rule for political activity or running for political office that is separate than the personal leave. Because I have some very definite feelings concerning that, but let's resolve this issue and then talk about the other. I don't know if we can, since this was the only agenda item, but I'm certainly willing to talk about that. Mr. Graham, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Stewart, you still there?
Yeah. Hi. I'm not alone.
Maybe you're the one that should be talking then.
I have another, I haven't thought this through yet, question. Looking down the road 5 years, associating this with nothing except a theoretical, hypothetical situation, is there any...
Nice job. Take on your next workout with Dr.
Well, somebody's doing something right.
That was perfect.
Tell all the kids to quit playing with their phones here, okay?
I don't know where it came from.
That was well said. Any chilling effect to running for political office by a university employee? Are we doing anything? Have we thought ahead sufficiently? Doing anything in the language at all that will be a deterrent, or maybe we want it to be a deterrent 5 years down the road? But there are policy reasons underlying all these things, obviously, and that's something I hope we've thought about as we're tinkering with this right now. But
I mean, I view this as just a clarification or a modernization of this rule to make it applicable to, the fact that political campaigns start, a year and a half, 2 years in advance of the election. That's the way I look at this, and that we are recognizing reality and changing the rule to meet it. And I don't see any chilling effect, but I may not be seeing something that's there.
Well, we've never had a policy that says, and I know we have differences on this board because I've talked to board members as to whether we should be encouraging or discouraging. We have differences of opinion on this board on that.
Other discussion?
Oh, somebody explain the import of just deleting that sentence. What's the reality of that if we delete that sentence? Does it then? It seems to me that there's no harm in deleting that sentence.
I don't see any harm, but I would defer to others also. I think it does clarify it takes away the ambiguity that Curator Steelman was referring to.
David, does that satisfy you?
Well, yeah. I mean, to the extent I can vote for it, I think it's an important change. And when I read it, I thought that this is going to be at least argued to grandfather in some situations that I personally would not vote to grandfather in. But yeah, I think it does no harm then, and I think it's a valuable change. I think that I have learned, and I don't know if anybody else agrees with me, that these situations are more complex than other leaves, but it does no harm.
But when we talk about grandfathering in, it doesn't change the current practical issue that you presented quite pointedly. It's not a question of grandfathering somebody in that's already on leave. That person is on leave, and the rule currently in the books allows that. The rule without that sentence still permits that.
That's right. I should have made it clear, John. I was concerned it would grandfather in the duration.
Oh, okay. Currently, with that sentence out, sorry I'm being so basic here, but if we take that sentence out, the duration somebody that is currently on leave who does run for office, who succeeds, his leave, assuming that it was granted for a year, his leave covers him, and if he succeeds in office, then he has to resign, period.
Well, he would also, if his leave is for a middle of a campaign, would have to apply to extend that leave. If he wanted to keep campaigning.
Questions? Discussion? Motion?
Don, this is Marcy Graham. Do we have any kind of a consensus on amended language now to make a motion on?
Well, if based on the absence of objection, I would suggest that the consensus is that the language that are contained in the materials at pages 2.4 and 2.5, accepting the sentence, the third from the last sentence in paragraph 2B. Is that a...
Is that square with your understanding?
Yes.
I would make a motion then that, let me get back to the proposed motion. I would recommend that, consistent with the President's recommendation, that the corrected rules and regulations, section 330050, referring to political activities, be amended as outlined in the attached document, which the board has considered and discussed, and that the changes become effective immediately. The attached proposed rule change, my motion would include deleting the third to last sentence in subparagraph small b.
Is that the right sentence?
I think there's only 3 sentences.
Yeah.
Such employee.
Yeah, the sentence that starts out with such employees not eligible and ends or his first day in office.
So there's no
Yeah, he had it right. That's third from the left.
Yeah.
I'm referring to starts out, such employee is not eligible to be rehired by the university.
Okay. Third to last. Okay.
Your parliamentarian couldn't hear very well. What was the effective date of the amendment?
Marcy?
Now, that's a pretty long sentence. You know, there's a semicolon there.
Marcy, are you talking into your phone? Because it's really hard to hear your voice.
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
I'm trying to turn you up, too.
Okay. I'm making the motion, but I'm also fearful of us doing this on the fly without thinking carefully about the end product here. So that sentence that seems to be a consensus of removing goes from such employee down to before accepting?
Yeah, it stops at the period before accepting.
Yeah. Well, that's my motion, at least to get it on the floor for discussion.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second the motion.
So, do we have Steve, are you prepared to give a a legal opinion as to the effect of that with respect to someone who is currently on leave, who has or is in the process of announcing for office. If we take the sentence out the way the motion reads, what are the implications of that with respect to that person remaining on leave through the election? And if unsuccessful, what happens to that person? Has that person still with the university?
The answer, am I prepared to give a legal opinion, is yes.
Still with the university.
No, wait a minute. I said the answer to the question of whether I am prepared to give a legal opinion is yes, I'm prepared to give one. Would you like me to give it in open session?
No.
Not necessarily. Can this be in closed session?
For a legal opinion, yes.
Well, is there maybe I'm just asking for consensus of the board. Do we want to go into closed session to discuss legal opinions and then come back? I always hate to do that, but
I actually think that may be a good idea.
Okay. Well,
but I am never in the consensus.
Well, I would
There's an
move to go into
alternative.
executive session to consider to receive a legal opinion.
We're going to
I'm
go
not
into
second
closed session anyway. We could perhaps defer. Include this during our closed session.
we've got to do this in open session.
I'm talking about the legal opinion piece.
Oh, the legal opinion.
And then return to public session later to conclude this, although that may not be very efficient. It's just a possibility. It's probably not very efficient. So, just a thought.
John, did you make a motion to go into executive session?
Yeah,
okay.
I did.
I'll second.
Okay. Cindy, would you call the roll?
Call the roll for the.
To go into executive session.
Oh,
And
we voted on that earlier.
no, okay, I apologize. I think for the purposes, because we have attendees that are, we've got quite a long executive session at the end. I'm thinking what we do, we have a brief executive session to just discuss the issues surrounding the language, and then we come back into open session, conclude the general business, and then we will go into executive session with the intention we will not come back into open session.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So
You're going to use the dial-in number, though, right?
Yes. So for those on the phone, other than curators, not really sure. We can't really give notice when we're coming back. So you will just have to check back. It'll be the same dial-in number that you'll use for this public session. At this point, we'll have to have everybody hang up from the public session line, and then the 3 curators on the phone will have you dial back into the closed session phone line.
okay, we're in executive session. Let's take 5 minutes to clear the rooms. We are back in open session after going into closed session for legal advice. We have a pending motion and second.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, this is Curator Graham who made that motion, and I'd like to withdraw that motion.
Okay.
I withdraw the second.
In view of the withdrawal of the second, Mr. Chairman, I would like to move the amendment to Rule 330.050 to amend that rule as proposed by President. Let me get back to this. And to have indicated that the collected rules and regulations, Section 330.050, having to do with political activities, be amended as outlined in the documents which was submitted to the board prior to this meeting, and to move its adoption with the following change, that under subparagraph 2B, small b as in boy, that the third to last sentence...
The conference is now being recorded.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
The third to last sentence that starts, such employee is not eligible, be deleted from that. That would end, that sentence would end with or the date or her first day of office.
Okay.
I would move approval and that its effective date be April 1, year 2016.
Okay. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second that motion.
Okay. Discussion. Hearing no discussion, Cindy, would you call the roll?
Curator Covington?
Yes.
Curator Cups?
Yes.
Curator Graham?
Yes.
Curator Henriksen?
Yes.
Curator Phillips?
Yes.
Curator Snowden?
Yes.
Curator Steelman?
Yes.
Curator Stewart?
Aye.
All votes in favor.
Thank you. Now I'm looking for my agenda. The next item appears to be if there's anything that anyone has for the good and welfare of the board. Oh, we voted on it.
We approved it
Okay,
first
I'm
off.
sorry.
Okay. There's nothing for the good and welfare of the board? Okay. Then we will go back into executive session. We do not anticipate coming back into open session, so for members that or for staff that are not required to be here for the closed session, you're excused, and we appreciate you being with us today.